Yeah, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about this Danny C. and what Chris and I termed the early New York Narcotics Anonymous. And we consider this another significant event in the history of Narcotics Anonymous. But in 1935, Danny was one of the first patients to go into Lexington, Kentucky to take, quote unquote, the cure. Sadly, it didn't quite take, and he arrives back in Lexington in 1948 for his 7th admission. So he begins attending Addicts Anonymous meetings during that time. He obviously graduates, and then he begins attending. Chris actually discovered this a little while ago in a newspaper article that he attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in New York City in '48 after he had gotten out of Lexington, Kentucky. He returns sometime in '48 for his 8th and his final stay, and he falls under the mentorship of Houston, who Danny actually says inspired me to learn to hope, to have faith at long last. And so in April of 1949, Danny returns to New York, and sometime that year, he actually starts the very first non-institutional community-based 12-step group for addicts. Now, Danny chose to call it Narcotics Anonymous. I've got some notes here. You see, guys, I'm getting a little bit older, so I can't remember everything like Chris can. But in a book called Drug Addiction in Youth, which was published in 1965, there's a man named Sherman Patrick who wrote an article called Our Way of Life, A Short History on Narcotics Anonymous, Inc. And he states that Danny chose to use the word Narcotics Anonymous instead of Addicts Anonymous because AA was pretty predominant in the New York area, and he didn't want to get the two initials confused. So he chose Narcotics Anonymous. Now, Danny's version of Narcotics Anonymous is different than the NA that exists today. Danny chose not to adopt the traditions of AA, and he had close affiliation with others. Some of those others were NACON, the Salvation Army, and other addicts, non-addict people, supporters, And this NACON, which was called the National Advisory Council on Narcotics, or Narcotics Anonymous, Inc., had some pretty interesting people in it. It had Marty Mann, and Marty Mann was an early pioneer woman in AA, and she actually founded the National Committee for Education on Alcoholism, whose mission it was to educate alcoholism as a disease and not a moral dilemma. And we had Dr. Marie Newswinder, who later on with her husband, Dr. Boyle, in 1965 actually started the first methadone maintenance program in New York City for the heroin epidemic that was going on at that time. They had Major Dorothy Berry of the Salvation Army, and they had Burton Lindheim, who was at that time a reporter for the New York Times and then became an editor. But we're going to let you listen to a board member by the name of Dr. Charles Winnick that we were really fortunate to be able to interview.
This may have been some of the more enjoyable research that I've done, because in looking into Dr. Winnick's history, I was able to purchase a 1960 Playboy magazine, and I purchased it only for the pictures, not for the stories. The picture you'll see on the next slide is of Dr. Winnick from that Playboy magazine. They had featured him in an article about his work with addicted jazz musicians. But as Boyd said, when we got this interview with him and heard him describe how they emerged, how NACON came to be, it really shed a lot of light onto the experience that Danny had, the experience that early addicts had. It reinforced the view that society held towards addicts.
We were concerned when we learned that the local office of the Bureau of Narcotics was interrupting NA meetings at the Y and arresting everybody there on the ground that they were doing something wrong.
So without any belief that addicts could recover, society wasn't pushing back against this predominant criminal justice response to addiction. And can you imagine finally coming out of a place like Lexington filled with hope and the possibility for finally for freedom, and to start a meeting and all of a sudden the Narcotics Bureau officers are coming in and arresting the members there?
So it's very understandable why Danny wanted to affiliate himself with some pretty heavy hitters there to help protect, his meeting. When you've got the Federal Bureau of Narcotics knocking on your door, you pretty much, do what you've got to do. It's real interesting that these folks were so committed that we've read that during a period of time when they had no place to hold meetings at, they actually held them on the Staten Island ferry. Seriously, I mean, that right there to me is just commitment, It really is.
I mean, real, perseverance, because I think in some ways if Danny folds to the pressure, then it just further perpetuates that lie that a person with addiction can never find recovery, that once an addict, they're always an addict.
So I'm going to tell you some of Danny's non-addict supporters. We've got Major Dorothy Berry, and she actually helped to make Danny's efforts legitimate. She legitimized Danny because she was a member of the Salvation Army, worked for the Salvation Army, and Danny actually used her office. He shared her office with him.
Dr. Marie Newswander, who Boyd mentioned with her husband, Dr. Dole, pioneered methadone maintenance treatment. She was on the NACON board, and in 1956, she wrote some impressions of Narcotics Anonymous, which were insightful. She says, "Narcotics Anonymous in New York is a noble attempt, but I think it is failing miserably. The alcoholic is aggressive. If you ask him his idea of a man, it is one who is rough and tough. That is the alcoholic's idea of what he would like to be. So far as I can see, the narcotic addict is not an aggressive. I ask him what he would like to be, and his answer is cool. There is no available aggression for Narcotics Anonymous. Perhaps Danny C. likes to retain authority, and in some ways, keeping other people from leadership. I don't see any hope in Narcotics Anonymous, but I support it." And so this kind of interesting observation that there is one person who's serving as the leader, and other people aren't moving into leadership roles. And we explore that as we look into why does this Narcotics Anonymous that started in New York, why doesn't it exist anymore?
So one of the ways that the transmission of the idea happened was Our Way of Life. Danny created a little booklet. It's the vehicle that he used. And we know that by February of 1951, the American Journal of Public Health actually announces that. So it's getting out to the professionals that there are now actually hope for the people that are addicted to drugs. And it has in here the 12 steps. Now, it's interesting in our research that we noticed that in the Miracles Happen book that was published by the Narcotics Anonymous World Service Office in around 1998 or 99, it actually says that the early New York NA had the 13 steps. Now, our research shows that, or we discovered that that is true, but we found it only after Danny's passing. So that was why we put it in here to just give reference that during Danny's lifetime, it was the 12 steps. And the 12 steps say, we admitted we are powerless over drugs, that our life had become unmanageable.
We're seeing a modification of step one. So we're seeing it evolve from the way Alcoholics Anonymous has worded it. We're powerless over alcohol, and it's evolving now to powerless over drugs. But we're going to see even further evolution of step one with the Narcotics Anonymous that exists today.
One of the uncredited contributions that Danny made to the movement of people addicted to substances besides alcohol is just media coverage. Danny put in the national consciousness that there was now hope for people addicted to drugs, that there is actually something out there that was like Alcoholics Anonymous, that people could recover from drug addiction.
There had to be something to combat the attitudes and beliefs that were held by society, that we see reflected in going into meetings and arresting addicts who are trying to meet for recovery. So, Danny's not following the traditions, but because of that, he's being public about what he's doing with Narcotics Anonymous. And that media coverage, as Boyd said, really puts into the national consciousness for the first time that maybe addicts could find recovery.
We're going to show you here just a little snippet of what we found. I mean, it's huge, the amount of ink that Danny got. One of them is Time Magazine, May 7th, 1951. It's an article written about the white stuff. Here we've got The Post, Drug Addicts Who Cure One Another, this was 1954. And here's actually a picture of Danny. These drug addicts cure one another. Now, in August of 1956, sadly, Danny passes away. What's interesting to Chris and I is how many newspapers and how far of a range that they actually picked up the passing. We found his obituary in the New York Times and the London Times, in the European Stars and Stripes and the Pacific Stars and Stripes. And we found it in 2 daily newspapers in Oklahoma and in Mississippi. Personally, the one for me that really took me was the one that in London Times. I'm like, wow, this really had a more far-reaching effect than I realized. Now, here's an actual headstone of Danny's grave. And there's a wonderful story about this particular headstone. There's a member of NA lives in Philadelphia, and his name is Danny M. And Danny he just really and truly wanted to find Danny's headstone, but he had no way of knowing where he was buried. He knew he was buried in New York somewhere. He knew that Danny died broke, that the Salvation Army was the one who actually buried Danny. He knew that from the writings that's pretty common. And so he discovered that Danny actually had a granddaughter that was still alive, living out of state. And so he got in touch with her, and she wrote to New York, whatever the official organization is there where you can actually find out where your relative is buried at. And they told her it was in Flushing, Queens, in a cemetery there. So Danny and some members of the New York History Book Committee, New York History Book Committee, went up to Flushing, Queens, and started to look for Danny's headstone, or where Danny was buried at. So they got to the gravesite, they went around, they couldn't seem to find it. They went to the guard in the shack, and they said, look, we can't find, Danny Carlson's headstone anywhere. Could you help us out? And he says, well, I'm not really supposed to do this, but he went and looked on his chart, and he found it, and he said he's buried right here. And so they went over there, and there was no headstone, none whatsoever. So Danny M. just, said, this can't be, He says, I really want to create something here. So my understanding is he put an email out, sent it out to how many people, I really don't know, asking for help, for contributions to be able to put a headstone here. And it's my understanding that 12 members of NA donated money for this headstone to be put in there. And so it's really pretty cool that 55 years after Danny's death in 2011, this headstone right here was actually laid in Flushing, Queens at Danny's gravesite. Yeah, we think that's a really cool thing.
In addition, as kind of a tribute, what they told us is that they put a Narcotics Anonymous Eternity medallion on the headstone. So, yeah. So I know it's just pretty cool. So after Danny's passing, a woman by the name of Elle actually takes over the leadership of Narcotics Anonymous in New York City. And Ray had a 19-year history with addiction. She spent 5 years in prison, and she actually sought treatment at Lexington, same place Danny was.
Ray met Danny at the Women's House of Detention in New York City when Danny was actually had a meeting there. He brought it in on Sunday nights. And so Ray's got a pretty, this picture right here is of her celebrating 9 years of recovery. And she's doing it in 1959 right here, and this is a newspaper article that's right beside it. And she's got some pretty interesting people there with her. There's Ray in the black dress right there. There's Dorothy Berry beside her. There's Anna Cross. And Anna Cross is the director of prisons of New York City. Is that right?
Yeah, Commissioner of Corrections. And Barney Ross, who's a former boxing champion.
Yeah, and so she's actually got some, pretty heavy hitter people here. Ray is actually the first known Hispanic woman to play a central role in the Recovery Mutual Aid group or society. She was hired a little bit later in 1963 to work at the office of the Narcotics Coordinator in New York City, and that was an office that actually gave out all the different services that New York provided, or New York City provided for addicts. We frequently see her name as the executive secretary of Narcotics Anonymous, and Ray helped establish NA meetings in really and truly a number of prisons. So she was very instrumental in that. Sadly, she passed away in October of 1972. And without the foundation of the 12 traditions, or somebody that's an identified successor, Narcotics Anonymous in New York City folded following her death.
And it kind of goes back a little bit to Dr. Newswander's observations about Danny retaining authority and then Ray becoming the other identified leader, but without a concept of rotating leadership that's kind of embodied in the 12 traditions, there was no other people that were involved to pick it up. So this is one of our first indications that the 12 traditions play a really vital role in helping 12-step fellowships survive. So because of that, we're going to go back to 1950. The 12 traditions were actually adopted at the first international conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was held in Cleveland, Ohio. And on July 29, 1950, they adopted the traditions. There's audio that we've been able to discover through our research and a picture of that convention or that conference that we'd like to share with you.
So these, my friends, are the principles upon which this society of ours think we would like to rest our future. Like everything in AA, there is nothing final about these pronouncements. Perhaps time will show us a better way. But in this hour, when we are passing from adolescence into maturity, isn't this a good time for us to ask ourselves, shall we adopt these traditions, those of us who sit here, as our platform? Not as an official act of this movement. This movement will never have or make an official act or pronouncement. But can't we express our sentiment about it? Alcoholics Anonymous, not by any virtue of ours certainly, but by force of circumstances, is a beautiful democracy, bordering almost on an anarchy. Then I suppose, by general acclamation, rather than any official act, we who are here in this hour of destiny may now be willing to rise and confirm the tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous.